In this lesson, we're discussing slavery in Arkansas. So slaves played a very important role in the growth of Arkansas Territory and later on the state of Arkansas. And even during the colonial times, there were slaves in the area that we now call Arkansas. For instance, the first slaves actually came to this area in 1720 as part of the John Law colony. So John Law was this Scotsman who sought an opportunity to bring settlers into this new world, and Arkansas Post was under control of the French at the time, and so the French granted him the right to establish a colony at Arkansas Post. The colony at the post failed, but some of those people stayed behind, and some of those people had been slaves. So what we don't have record of is, exactly who stayed and exactly their position at the time. So if a slave owner left and a slave stayed, then that slave would have been a freedman, but we don't know exactly how many stayed or if any were freed at all at that particular time. The colony failed for a lot of different reasons. Basically, John Law just couldn't keep enough money rolling in to support the small colony, and so if it flooded, they'd move up the river a little bit, and during drought, they'd move back down. So it just was a bad situation to begin with as far as the territory itself went, and the colony failed, but we did have slaves in this area in 1720. I think sometimes because we know what we know about the South and slavery, we just tend to assume that everyone in the South had slaves and that there were a lot of slaves. That's not always true in every slave state. So I want us to look at the real numbers for that so you can kind of see a pattern developing. In 1810, there were 188 slaves in what we now know as Arkansas to 1,062 white people. So that was 17% of the population were slaves in 1810. Then in 1820, we see a big jump from 188 slaves to 1,617 slaves. That's a huge jump. However, the white population also jumped. So there were still only 11%, or there was still only 11% slave population in Arkansas in 1820, and there were 59 free blacks registered in the state at the time as well. In 1830, there were 4,716 slaves and 30,500 white population. So 15% of the population was slave labor in 1830. So we have it growing. It percentage-wise actually decreased from the 10-year period of 1810 to 1820, but now it's grown 4%. And now look how much it grows in 1840. 20,400 slaves to the 77,174 white people in the area. That's 26% of the population was slaves. So we're still talking about it's hovering right around a quarter, so 25%. In 1860, it went up just a little bit to 26%, with a little over 100,000 slaves to more than 400,000 white people. And we see the free black number rising again. 144 free blacks in Arkansas in 1860. That's still pre-Civil War time. So I wanted to put these numbers out there so we can see an actual count of slavery across the state. I think I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that you would see this map a lot throughout the semester, and here we are with it again. So just to point out to you where the regions are and where slavery was at this particular time. So it's obvious that plantations, specifically cotton plantations, had the largest slave population at any given time in the state. And those were found in the coastal plain and the Mississippi alluvial plain, the Delta. So 74% of the slave population was located in those two areas. By 1860, 11% were owned by white families with 1 to 4 slaves. So, not necessarily a plantation setting at all. We're talking about maybe small farm situations where there are, you know, extra farm hands that are employed, I say employed, that are enslaved for farmhand work or for in-home work as a maid or a cook or something like that. So 1 to 4, 11% in 1860. 43% owned 5 to 24 slaves, and 46% were owned by plantations with 25 to 500 plus slaves. So we have definitely the largest concentration of slavery focused on major, massive agricultural operations. Again, that 43% owned by whites with 5 to 24 slaves, that would be a mid-level kind of farm operation. More than subsistence farming, but not nearly as big as a plantation. You know, we always talk about the living conditions of slaves, and I think it's easy to see that because that there were so many slaves on plantations, that those living conditions could easily be worse just because there was no connection really with the plantation owner usually. So how that worked is like a plantation owner usually hired someone to be a slave master, or they handpicked a slave that they trusted to kind of manage the slaves. So there was a disconnect between the people doing the work and the people who were the slave owners. So because of that, no personal relationships developed, and slaves were not seen as people. And living conditions were much worse in that regard. These people were pretty much treated as livestock, hard labor livestock, and so for that reason they weren't given any kind of luxuries really. Living conditions for slaves in small households were usually better because you did get to know each other as people. Now, I'm not saying that it was a perfect situation or that it was better, because the end result is still slavery. But usually, as far as living conditions themselves, you know, where people are going to lay their head and where they're going to have their meals, or if they're going to have meals, that was usually better in small households. But it varied. It varied greatly because not just of where the slaves were serving, but it varied by the people who owned them. You know, if they were fortunate enough to be owned in a small setting and by a compassionate family, then things were generally a little better. Of course, don't forget the end result was still the same. I mean, these were people who had no civil rights. They were basically property. So as bad as the plantation setting was, the good thing about it is that lack of relationship with the owner gave slaves a little more opportunity to develop their own community. They weren't so tied to the specific owner and what the owner wanted all the time in that larger setting. So they could keep some traditions or form their own traditions. Eventually they were allowed to hold religious services, and the plantation owners during the Great Awakening period were actually kind of thinking that that was a good idea to allow slaves to hold religious services, because religion teaches obedience and you know, being loyal and truthful and all of that stuff. So the plantation owners were all about allowing slaves to hold religious services. They also developed folk remedies, and people who were more skilled in those became very important, not just among the slaves at the plantation, but to whole communities. Sometimes slaves would be given a pass to go to another plantation to help another group of people out, either slave or a member of the master's family there. Oral histories were also an important way to preserve history. That's how they told stories from the past and how they created legends and kept those stories alive that kind of created a very unique culture. And the slaves on plantations also had larger extended families. Marriage wasn't allowed, so we can't necessarily say that this was a legal family, but there were people who cared about each other and they all looked after each other, and that's because they had no one else to look out for them, so they did look out for each other. And this extended family created a huge community that these slaves began to depend upon. Okay, and I'll just touch back on these demographics a little bit. By 1865, only 4% of the state's population lived in cities or towns. So most slaves, like the rest of the population, lived out in the country. They were rural and very much focused on agriculture, at least to a small degree. In 1860, there were 3,799 urban slaves in the state. So these people actually served families who lived in cities. And the urban slaves were cooks, maids, nurses, gardeners, coachmen, etc. And when I say nurses, I mean more like nannies. So, child care, cooks, maids, gardeners, coachmen, handymen, and that kind of work that you might need done in a home. So let's take just a minute to look at the number of free blacks who lived in pre-Civil War Arkansas. I've mentioned the free blacks already when we were talking about the demographics of slavery, but just to kind of point out a little bit more, there were 608 free blacks living in Arkansas in 1850. That's the most that had been registered before the Civil War. And most of those were the beneficiaries of manumission. Manumission is the legal process of freeing slaves. So that's when a slave owner says, I declare my slaves to be free, does the legal paperwork so that ownership ceases and these slaves now are freedmen who have rights and benefits. 2/3 of the freedmen in pre-Civil War Arkansas were of mixed race. Most of them lived in rural areas with a large population in Marion County. These free blacks could own real estate, but they could not testify in court. And a handful of those free blacks actually owned slaves themselves. Now, usually students ask, hey, but were they treated better? I don't know. I don't know that. We don't really have any kind of details about that. I'm hoping that over probably the next 15 to 20 years, we start finding more information about that. Someone finds a diary or something, and we know a lot more information about that. We just don't know at this point. In the 1820s and 1830s, slave owners started fearing the abolition movement, and they also start fearing slave insurrection. So Arkansas institutes slave patrols, and slaves must have a pass to leave their plantation or home. I mentioned that before when I was talking about living conditions, that if, say, someone who is skilled in herbal remedies, a slave who is skilled in herbal remedies from one plantation might be requested to go to another plantation, they would have a pass to allow them to do that, and it would tell them when they would have to be returning home as well. So it was a pass, like a hall pass, only not for halls. Then in 1842, the state legislature passed a law to prohibit free blacks from moving into the state. So this doesn't impact the free blacks who currently live in the state, just free blacks who might want to move into the state. That changes, though, in 1859, when the legislature expels all free blacks over age 21 from the state. Any who remain after January 1st, 1860 would become slaves. Can you imagine? You're free, and on January 1, 1860, if you're still around, you become a slave. That means anyone who could snag you could claim you. That just blows my mind to think about. Even despite that, 144 free blacks still remained in the state. In 1861, the state legislature puts the law on hold until 1863, which is the day the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect. And slaves did fight in the Civil War. The U.S. Army asked freedmen to volunteer, and 3 black companies from Arkansas are actually formed in Helena. The 1st Arkansas Volunteer Infantry Regiment of African descent was led by Captain Lindley Miller of New York. And 5,000 or more former slaves in Arkansas actually joined the Union Army. The Confederate States of America did not recruit slaves, and the reason for that is really pretty logical. They knew, the Confederacy knew that asking slaves to fight for the cause that would keep them enslaved just didn't seem like a logical choice, There was fear that the slaves might run and join the other side so that they could be freed. And that did happen some. In 1865, the Confederacy starts allowing slaves to enlist because they need more people. They need more people in the field. They're running low, and they need soldiers. So in 1865, the Confederacy allows slaves to serve in the Confederate Army, but they don't promise freedom in exchange. The whole idea behind this fighting was to keep them enslaved, and even fighting for the cause wouldn't release them. So there were not a lot of slaves who enlisted, but some did. In terms of Union troops, black soldiers manned all the forts in Helena for a solid year from 1864 to 1865, and the 2nd Arkansas Colored Infantry, which was later known as the 54th U.S. Colored Volunteers, actually got back pay in 1864. The Union ended up paying them half of what the white soldiers made, but the mistake was pointed out, and that was corrected in 1864 when all of these African American soldiers who volunteered for the Union Army got their back pay. Black troops fought in 28 battles or skirmishes in Arkansas during the Civil War in total. And this is a list of the black Union troops that actually served in Arkansas. After the Battle of Honey Springs in Indian Territory, which now we call Oklahoma, Major General James Blunt said of the African American forces that he had never seen such fine fighting as they had done, and that these African American soldiers made better soldiers in every respect than any troop that he'd ever commanded. So this was a strong statement to really basically personify these African American volunteers for the Army, because these people had been enslaved at some point, and the idea that they were now serving alongside other men in the military showed a degree of equality, and that's what Blunt was doing with this statement. In the Battle of Poison Spring in Arkansas, which was April 18, 1864, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry took a big hit that day from the Confederate soldiers, who were merciless to any and everyone they captured and to all the wounded on the field. They killed anyone they could come in contact with, and they were especially cruel to the black soldiers. That day, 117 died and 65 were wounded in that battle. So a few days later, on April 30th, 1864, at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, now in Grant County, the 2nd Kansas Colored Regiment fought there. And those black soldiers who were fighting at Jenkins Ferry kept in mind what happened to the black soldiers at Poison Spring at the hands of the Confederacy just days earlier. So some of these black soldiers executed Confederate soldiers just like they had done to the blacks at Poison Spring that day.